Hello, students. It is wonderful to be here today with you. We have a guest speaker. We have Zuri Reyes Borrero, who is from the Centers for Victims of Torture. And Zuri, thank you so much for being here. I'm glad that you. I'm glad about the work that you do, and I'm glad that we can learn from about the work that you do.
No problem. I'm glad to be here.
So I guess we'll just jump right into the interview. If just for starters, could you talk a little bit about the mission of CVT and the type of work that is done at CVT?
Sure. So the Center for Victims of Torture originally started in Minnesota in the 80s. And the reason why it was a response to all of this immigration waves that were coming at that point, where there were some specific needs of the population. And because of their circumstances, for instance, we have in the Minneapolis area, there's a high number of Somali refugees. You had all these histories of complex trauma that were unaddressed and that we didn't quite have the equipment to deal with in these populations. So CVT started with the goal of making it a torture-free world and making every effort that we can to strive toward there. And the way that we do that has to do primarily with rehabilitation of victims of torture, but also other programs such as capacitating advocacy around the world in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Africa. And we work also very closely with policy and advocacy for policy, so that we are hitting both the microsphere and the mesosphere, and also the macrosphere of the wider level of social work impact.
Yes, thank you. And do you tend to work with, in terms of like the rehabilitation counseling aspects, do you tend to work with adults, families, kids? Who's your clientele generally?
Well, that's going to depend on the specific program. We have several programs around the country and around the world, and every program has slightly different demographics and slightly different situations. For instance, the program that is based at the border, which is the program that I work on, it's called Proyecto Mariposa. We primarily work with family units. However, places like the St. Paul Healing Center or our programs in St. Cloud, Minnesota, are going to be focused on individuals, and they're going to be usually targeted toward different groups. For instance, the St. Cloud program works with the Karen refugees. Here in Tucson, we primarily work with asylum seekers, and primarily from Latin American countries.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you share an example of a successful intervention or program that your agency has implemented?
Yes. So we have actually, we've always taken pride in the fact that we have several different programs that we spearheaded either as research or pilot programs that can then be shown to be replicated or being able to be replicated. So we've dealt with some different populations, and their needs are going to be different, of course. In the case of the program here at the border, one of our biggest successes has been that sometimes with relatively short-term case management, we can have folks stabilize in a much more permanent or well-suited way than if they were trying to figure out these things. There's a little bit of referrals, a little bit of advocacy, and a little bit of cultural brokering can all go a long way. And a good example of that is that we've had a number of Haitian and Cuban clients that because of US law, they are actually entitled to certain benefits when they arrive, such as Medicaid and such as food stamps, right? But a significant amount of them don't know that they do. So, and moreover, even if they do, a lot of the states in the union have their welfare offices have refugee working groups, but not asylum seeking groups. So
Yeah.
they might not have people who have the expertise to know what's what, and a lot of people fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
So case management helps to kind of level that playing field by assisting people in procuring those benefits that they should already have access to.
Hmm.
And that's an example of how even a relatively small intervention can have significant repercussions.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I appreciate it. Um, so what are common challenges that you've encountered in your work with survivors, and how have you addressed those challenges?
Oh, well, there's a lot of challenges right now. Primarily, on the one hand, you have all of this history of complex trauma that is being compounded one upon the other. Like you have, for instance, the original reasons why they left their country, whether that is persecution, whether that is um, trafficking, whether that is whatever the reason may be. Then you have to add to that the normal brief of migration, aside from the traumatic aspects of it, such as leaving your culture and having to broker all these new things, learning a new language, so on and so forth. And then you have to add to that the layer of the trip. For some people, it takes them actually years from wherever they started, for instance, in Guinea-Bissau, until they make it to the United States. Um, that can be a year-long process where things happen, where you're exposed to kidnappings, discrimination, then be deprivation, lack of medical care, lack of food, lack of stable work environment, lack of housing, so on and so forth. And then when they arrive in the United States, especially asylum seekers, there is this dearth of services, um, because there's definitely a lot more need than there is capacity in terms of um, assistance with community rebuilding, as far as assistance with the provision of mental health services, as far as the provision of immediate relief assistance, housing, food, shelter. And there's a lot of misconceptions about how the US immigration system works, so that people don't quite know what they're heading up into until they get here. So that adds another layer of shock, another layer of sometimes disillusionment, another layer of despair that has to be worked upon. So you have all these things on top of the regular things, such as whether your kid is feeling sick, whether your family, your country of origin is doing well, whether somebody there gets sick after you leave, and now who's going to take care of that person, just all of these different things. And they all compound one upon another. And we just don't have right now a good system that can assist these people who are in movement, despite the fact that we know that we are always going to have people who are going to be displaced, and we're always going to have people who are going to be in movement.
Yeah. 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 Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Um, how does your agency ensure that the interventions are culturally appropriate? I know that people are coming from all over the world, and you're working at the border here, but it's not just people from Latin America that are traveling and crossing the border right there. So, how do you respond to so many different cultures, and remain sensitive to all the cultural differences as you work with people from such diverse backgrounds?
I mean, the central aspect, and this is something I'm sure your students have heard before, is the term cultural humility, right? Um, there's this saying that is like, all I know is that I know nothing. And
Hmm.
that sounds, I feel like that encapsulates kind of how we need to take our approach to working uh, within our own cultures as well as within other cultures, right? Having always the capacity to understand that there's more to learn, that there is more to revise, and that there is more to expand upon our knowledge, and not falling into the trap of kind of assuming that we've figured out certain groups. For instance, like you said, there is a lot of assumptions that people who come from to the US border are going to be Latin American. And at one point, you might have said that this was a trend that was fairly consistent. But currently, we have people from all over the world. We have Chinese nationals, Indian nationals, people from Congo, people from Algeria, people from Ukraine, of course, and Russia. We have people from all over the world who are coming through our borders who are not necessarily what we expect to be the typical client. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware that there are current conditions in the world that make it so that some people are going to be in movement at any given time. We have several conflicts occurring that are going to spur people on. As an example, we recently had a situation where the president of Tunisia made some very disparaging comments about Black people, people who come from sub-Saharan Africa, and that escalated into some tension. That tension can easily escalate into people being in movement, whether they come to the US or elsewhere. They're still going to be on the move. We have situations such as the ongoing issue with Ukraine and Russia, of course, that have been very well covered by the media, that also exemplify the movement of people, right? And even when we think of, oh, this wouldn't happen in this particular area, the reality is that conflict springs up everywhere. Yeah. So being conscious of that, how that affects our flows, and also how sometimes the flows are the result of something that is secondary. And let me explain what I mean by that. For instance, about 10-ish years ago, we had a pretty big earthquake in Haiti, right? A lot of these people at that point went to places like Chile and Brazil. Brazil particularly was looking for people because there was some kind of big sporting event. I don't remember if it was the Olympics or what, but there was a lot of building that was going on at that point. So these people, hey, we need labor, come over here. 10 years later, COVID hits, economies shift, and now these people are no longer welcome. And now these people don't have necessarily the option of going back to Haiti because just last year they had a political assassination of the president. So there's a lot of instability there right now as well. So why are we seeing all of this migration up to the US border of Haitians? Well, there's your answer. A lot of them are coming from Haiti, yes, but a lot of them are also coming from places in Latin America where they had previously settled and are, for whatever reason, back to movement. So yeah. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of complexity and understanding that we don't always know everything at face from the get-go, and that's okay. Yeah. But it's a matter of being willing to learn, to explore, and also to always ask people what they want. Always know that at the end of the day, our clients know what's in their best interest. And even if they do something that we consider is not in their best interest, it is still their choice. Yeah. Yes, exactly. So you brought up the existence of COVID as what has been your perception of the impact of COVID on the mental health of the clients with whom you work over the last couple of years? What is that? How have you seen that transition, and how has it particularly impacted the migrant population? Well, I think it's fair to say that a significant amount of the population in general has really felt the effects of COVID. And I don't know if I'm the only one, but for instance, ever since late 2019 onward, I feel like my years have kind of gotten mixed together, and it's not as clear. It's been a blur, and sometimes it's like, oh yeah, this thing happened in 2019. That was 4 years ago, and I'm like, where did that time go? What do you mean it was 4 years ago? Our sense of normalcy was so impacted, right? This happened, of course, with populations all over the world. This was a global pandemic, and some countries addressed it more effectively than others. Some had more resources to throw into it than others. But ultimately, a lot of people suffered the consequences. And ultimately, a lot of countries, I guess, didn't realize just quite how pervasive a mental health deprivation could be until you have a situation like this, where you have a substantial amount of people across all these different segments being affected simultaneously. So we have the normal issues of isolation, of having even more difficulty finding community, because a lot of activities that might be used in non-Western um, context to build community can be group based. For instance, instead of traditional talk therapy, when it is one-on-one, a lot of group therapy happens. Those
Mhm.
kinds of things are more difficult to do with COVID. Not everybody has access to the Zoom capabilities or to the hardware to make it work in the same way, right? So it affected people's capability to engage in services. It affected the economies around the world that make it so that the flow of people changes. It affected how some people are welcome or not into some places. Like I just gave the example of Haitians in Brazil and Chile as an
Mhm.
example of something that very much had something to do with COVID. Um, it also impacted ultimately our capacity to, I think in a way you could say everybody's tired, and in a way it has kind of depleted our kindness almost, say.
Mhm.
And it's so on the level of the social workers or the actual staff, there's a lot of burnout, there's a lot of feelings of tiredness, there's a lot of feelings of resentment due to lack of, I don't feel like I'm getting the support that I need. There's a lot of places that kind of have been operating on kind of a crisis mode for the past couple of years because we have not been able to hire people fast enough and so on and so forth. So at every single level, it has impacted us in some ways that are very easy to tell and some that are not so easy to tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for highlighting all of those. Um, uh, just in our own university system, you can definitely see the ripple effects of COVID on our students and on our staff also. Um, so last question is there any recommendations or advice that you might want to give folks who are interested in working with migrant or refugee populations?
I think if you have the chance, I think a great idea to the extent that's possible is that international social work has not been quite as established within the profession as, say, school social work or working with military families or things like that, but it's slowly coming to its own. And I feel like a lot of the things that at the end of the day affect migrants are going to be by their very nature transnational,
Yep.
and they're going to require a wider look at the circumstances. And for that reason, I encourage people to kind of really think about that critically, whether that is if you're able to take a class, that's great. If not, there's some great resources, and kind of go a little beyond what has traditionally been our way of dealing with, for instance, reconstruction in post-conflict societies. Like ever since the 80s, the ways that war has been waged has changed drastically, and that has also meant that our relief models that we built after World War II are no longer valid in the same way. So
Yeah.
we're at a junction where we're seeing more and more that we need to treat these transnational flows of migration transnationally within organizations and within programs. And we're also seeing that need to think kind of a wider picture where it's not just relief, but actually capacity and community building.
Yeah.
So I think if you can think of that a little bit, if you can take a class on that, and also it absolutely never hurts to have some language skills, because believe me, it really, even if you think it's the most obscure language and there's no way anyone's ever going to speak this, somebody is going to help.
Somebody.
Like French, I took French in my first year of college because I had to take a language class, and that saved my butt with a lot of my Haitian families to just at least be able to explain things while I got a translator on the phone. So that I always recommend that if you can, goes a long way.
Thank you so much, Zareen, for your time, for your thoughtful sharing about your experiences and the work of Centers for Victims of Torture. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Not a problem. And we're always looking for interns. We're always happy to talk more, because at the end of the day, that's what we want, right? We want a more robust social work system for everyone. So feel free to share my email address with your students and things like that. And if I can be of any help, I'm more than happy to be of help.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem.